I heard my wife telling her best friend how amazing her new lover was, and no, she had no idea I was there, behind the hallway door, hearing every word like a blade piercing my chest. I didn't scream, I didn't slam the door, I didn't break the glass of wine that was in my hand. I just turned my back and walked slowly to the porch, swallowing the urge to cry, stifling the urge to confront her right there, and letting my mind silently plan, step by step, what would be the beginning of her end. And our marriage. It's strange how pain transforms time. The seconds pass slowly, viscously, as if the air has become too thick to breathe. Every sentence she said in that conversation was a stab accompanied by a smile. She spoke about him with a sparkle in her eyes that she hadn't had in years when she spoke about me. "He's wonderful, he makes me feel alive again," she said, laughing, as if she were talking about a romantic movie. The friend agreed, encouraging, as if betrayal was empowerment, as if throwing away decades of history was just a detail. "You deserve this, friend. After everything you put up with him." And I, therefore me, the one who put her first even when everything screamed for me to put myself somewhere. The love, apparently, was mine alone. And even though it was just mine, she managed to destroy it. It wasn't just about the physical betrayal. It was the theater built around me. The fake hugs, the fake looks, the vacation plans and the kisses on the forehead. It was the fact that I was the last to know about my own misfortune. I loved that woman. And loving too much, now I know, can be the biggest trap of all. It makes you blind, foolish, vulnerable. Makes you easy to deceive. But what she didn't know, and what that complicit friend would never imagine, is that I heard it. I heard every word, every sigh, every muffled laugh between confessions. And listening was all I needed to start my own show. A spectacle of revelation, pain, and justice. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't confront. I just planned it. I spent days with her as if nothing had happened. I made love to her. I cooked for her. I put flowers in the car before I left for work. I smiled. I called her my love and let her believe in every gesture. The lie was hers, but now the control was mine. I was the director of the play that she barely knew was about to premiere. Each scene was thought out with precision, the date, the place, the guests, the atmosphere, the ambient music. Everything would have a purpose. She betrayed me behind the scenes of our life. I would confront her in the spotlight. There was a date approaching, perfect for what I had in mind. She loved parties, bringing people together, celebrating birthdays as if they were gala events. So I organized everything. A surprise party for her. Or at least that's what everyone believed. I called friends, family, co-workers. I told everyone that it would be a tribute to the woman in my life, a celebration of our love. And no one doubted it. After all, we were the perfect couple. She herself hugged me in the hallway, days before the party, and said, "You've been weird lately, but I like seeing you go out of your way for us again." She thought she had won. I thought I could have it all, the devoted husband, the vibrant lover, the enchanted family. But she didn't know my silence. On the big day, she entered the party with a princess smile. Everyone applauded her. She loved that. The lights, the looks, the toasts. And me? I was just waiting for the exact moment. I waited until everyone had the cup in their hands. I waited until the sound of the music died down for my speech to begin. I went up to the small makeshift stage in the event hall and called her to my side. She walked towards me with that look of a loved, victorious woman. And then, I started talking. Tonight is really special. It's a celebration of a woman who taught me everything I needed to know about love, loyalty, and betrayal. The hall fell silent. She laughed, disconcerted. He tried to whisper something in my ear. But I continued. For years, I was the man who offered you everything. Love, respect, protection. And you, while everyone thought you loved me, whispered to your best friend how wonderful your new lover was. A buzz began to grow. She tried to pull me by the arm, but I had already pressed the button on the remote control hidden in my jacket pocket. The speakers made a click. And then, the recording started. Her voice echoed clearly throughout the room, laughing, telling details about her lover, describing our marriage as a weight she carried out of pity. There was a stunned silence. The kind of silence that precedes chaos. People began to turn, to look at each other. She was paralyzed. The hand is still on my arm, but without any strength. The tears started to fall. But it was too late. The show had begun, and she was the star of the scandal she wrote. I still remember the moment her mother slowly lowered the glass, looking at her daughter as if seeing a stranger. I remember the cousin who covered her mouth with her hands and the brother who left the room without saying a word. The best friend, an accomplice in the whole farce, had her face taken over by a grotesque panic. And me? I continued standing, serene, in front of the world she built for herself, crumbling with every word she herself had said, and which now burned in the ears of everyone there. This wasn't just revenge. It was a mirror. A monstrous reflection of the woman I once swore to love. And while everyone was still processing what they had just heard, I got off the stage, walked to the exit, and left her to stay there, alone, in the center of the ruin she caused with her own hands. There was nothing more to say. Only one last letter on the table, the divorce envelope, delivered at the reception of the event, with enough witnesses to seal the most bitter separation in that city. But what she still doesn't know, and what no one there could imagine, is that there was one more secret that night. Something that was not revealed in the salon. Something that would change the course of that story even further. A silent piece, still hidden, that wasn't about her, but about me. And about the woman who, unlike her, listened to me in silence, understood me without demanding, and offered me a chance to start over. Because, in the end, the biggest twist isn't about who cheats, but about who rises up after being betrayed. Now tell me, if you thought you knew how this story ends, and discovered that the most unexpected part was still missing, would you have the courage to leave now? Welcome to the channel. Here, we make something clear from the beginning: we never support any type of betrayal. The stories told are fictitious, created to show with depth and realism how betrayal is capable of destroying lives, relationships and futures. These are dramatic, intense plots, with a single mission: make you reflect. Now sit back, take a deep breath. Get ready to hear a shocking story. Jonathan and Emily met on an autumn afternoon that seemed like something out of a movie, when the world still seemed like a place where love was eternal and smiles lasted longer than the seasons. He, a civil engineer with a calm speech and an attentive look, had dedicated his life to transforming structures into homes, while she, a literature teacher and enthusiast of the beauty of small gestures, enchanted her students with words and gestures that made ordinary days seem special. There was no exact moment when they fell in love, but rather a sequence of meetings, comfortable silences and looks that needed no explanation. Over time, they built a marriage that seemed solid, not only because of the complicity they shared, but because of their mutual dedication to making it work even in the most difficult times. The house where they lived reflected the care they took with their life together. It was a simple building, but each room held stories, laughter, hugs and small gestures of affection that had multiplied over the years. Jonathan always liked to start the day by leaving a sweet note next to Emily's cup of coffee, and she, in turn, made a point of watering the plants he loved so much, even when time was tight. They didn't have children, but they had plans, many plans. Trips you haven't taken yet, renovations you've postponed due to lack of time, books you promised to read together. There was a beautiful tranquility between them, the kind of love that doesn't make noise, but sustains the world of those who live it. The couple's friends always commented on the harmony between them. Emily was more talkative, spontaneous, and had a sweet way that was easily captivating. Jonathan was more introspective, but when he spoke, his words had weight and intention. They balanced themselves with a rare naturalness. At Friday dinners, when friends or family were entertained, He would be in charge of the barbecue while she circulated among the guests, always with a smile on his face and a glass of wine in his hand. They were praised, admired, and perhaps that was the most dangerous detail, no one imagined that anything could shake that apparently unbreakable bond. The routine, although comfortable, had become predictable over time. Jonathan spent many hours away from home due to new projects and ongoing contracts. Emily, after years of teaching, had gotten a promotion and started to coordinate the school's literature department, which also required more time and energy. Lunches became quick, dinners less frequent, and conversations began to happen between one cell phone notification and another. Still, there was affection. There was care. He liked watching her read before bed, listening to the sound of her laughter on the phone with her sister, seeing how she was moved by old movies. And she melted at the way he always remembered every important date, how he adjusted the collar of his coat before leaving, how he looked at her when he thought no one was watching. They had just completed 12 years of marriage. They celebrated in a simple way, with a dinner for two at the restaurant where they had their first date. Emily wore the same red dress as years ago, and Jonathan, although grayer and tired, still had the same youthful tenderness in his eyes. They talked about time, about life, about how everything seemed to have gone by so quickly. They talked about the changes, the achievements, the beauty of having grown up together. And that night, when they got home, they danced in the middle of the living room to some music, as if the whole world had fit back into the palm of their hands. Despite this, there were signs. Small details that slipped through your fingers like sand. Jonathan noticed that Emily was more distant at times, her eyes lost in places where he couldn't reach her. She, in turn, noticed his exhaustion, the way he avoided talking about work, how sometimes he seemed to be there just out of obligation. Neither of them commented. Maybe because they were afraid of facing what could be behind the change, or maybe because they naively believed that it was just a phase like so many others they had already overcome. Emily started going out with friends more, coming home from work later, and even when she was home, she seemed mentally distant. Jonathan, in turn, immersed himself in work as a way to escape the growing feeling of missing something he wasn't even sure what it was. They spent more time in the same physical space, but in different realities. They still exchanged affection, they still said, "good night," and "good morning," but there was something in the air, a present absence, an invisible gap that grew every day. The surrounding environment was also beginning to change. The school where Emily worked was going through a period of renewal, with new teachers, projects and events. Jonathan, in turn, had been invited to participate in a consortium that would require some travel and strategic meetings. Each one seemed to live in a different world, and the connection that was once the foundation of everything now wavered like a light bulb about to go out. Still, they both tried. They tried with the strength of someone who had already built too much to see it all fall apart. But sometimes, trying is not enough. One night, during a storm, the power to the house went out. Sitting in the dark, with candles lit and a bottle of wine shared between them, Jonathan talked about the project in another city, about how this could be a new phase for both of them. Emily smiled, but her smile seemed more like an automatic reflex than a genuine feeling. She talked about the students, about the plans for the new semester, about how happy she felt to be growing professionally. It was a conversation like any other, but there was a void filling the spaces between the words. It wasn't lovelessness. It was something more difficult to explain. Maybe the wear and tear, maybe the sum of silences, or who knows, the silent certainty that something had changed profoundly. Jonathan believed they were just going through a difficult time. Emily wasn't so sure anymore. But the two continued to pretend that everything was in place, that all it took was time for things to return to normal. And in this pretense, every gesture, every touch and every look became part of a delicate dance, where one false step could destroy everything. That Saturday morning, when Jonathan woke up early and made pancakes like he did in the old days, Emily came downstairs with a faded smile. They sat together, shared coffee, laughed at an old joke. It was almost as if everything was fine. But deep down, each one carried a question that they still didn't have the courage to ask: how far does silence go before it becomes distance? The day continued with walks, shopping, a quick visit to the mother-in-law and even a movie session at home. Emily allowed herself to laugh, Jonathan allowed himself to dream. But the calm hit a tide about to turn. And when he went out to buy wine in the late afternoon, she took the opportunity to make a call. A quick conversation. A complicit whisper. Something he didn't hear at that time. But it would soon become impossible to ignore. Because sometimes, what seems like the height of peace, is just the silence before the storm. And in that house, where so much love was experienced, something much bigger than time was about to be broken. Emily began to dedicate herself more and more to the school environment, involved in new projects and events that occupied her mornings, afternoons and, eventually, some nights. Jonathan noticed the increasing absence, but said nothing. He preferred to believe that it was just a phase of professional growth, and he was silently proud to see her so involved with something she loved. Sometimes he would prepare dinner and she wouldn't come, telling him via message that she was in a meeting with coordinators or resolving problems with students' parents. At other times, she would arrive so tired that they barely exchanged words before going to sleep. Jonathan got used to eating alone and leaving her plate aside, waiting for a microwave and a hunger that often didn't come anymore. He occupied himself as best he could. He immersed himself in the construction company's new projects, but without forgetting to notice the changes around him. The way Emily switched her cell phone when he got close. The laughter contained during text messages. The rush to leave early. The strongest perfumes, the exaggerated care with clothes that, before, I only wore on special occasions. The emptiness in the bed next to him on Friday nights, when she said she preferred to sleep on the couch watching series, citing a headache or simply tiredness. All of this was registered, silently, within a heart that was beginning to suspect the obvious, but insisted on not accepting it. It was on a rainy afternoon, when Jonathan arrived home early because of a cancelled meeting, that something changed. The muffled sound of feminine laughter came from the guest room, which Emily had turned into a small office for schoolwork. The door was ajar, and her voice was clear. She was talking to someone on the phone, perhaps via video, as there were pauses, subtle responses and that intimate tone that is reserved for confidences. Jonathan walked to the door in silence, without making any noise. When he peered through the crack, he only saw a quick reflection in the mirror, Emily's flushed face, smiling in a way that she hadn't smiled at him in a long time. He felt a shiver, as if his entire body had been pushed against an invisible wall. And I didn't say anything. He got back in the car in the rain and drove aimlessly for almost an hour, trying to fit together the pieces of a puzzle he didn't want to put together. Over the next few days, Jonathan began to observe more closely. He noticed that Emily always had explanations for everything, and that these explanations became more and more detailed, as if they were rehearsed. The new perfume was a gift from a colleague. The strong lipstick, an attempt to appear more confident in meetings. A change in the cell phone code, a system update. He didn't confront her. He kept everything inside himself, like someone waiting for reality to explain itself. But the anguish grew, as did the void between them. And then, one night, while organizing the hall closets in search of an old charger, he found a small box, hidden behind books. Inside was a handwritten letter. It wasn't addressed to him. It was a letter written by Emily to someone she called Breathing. The words were filled with longing, desire, promises. There was no name. But there was a feeling that Jonathan didn't recognize as his own. He sat on the cold floor of the hallway, letter in hand, and read everything once again. The words danced before the eyes, as if the paper was burning. He felt stupid, betrayed, but still incredulous. I wanted to tear up the letter, run to her and ask who the man she was writing to with so much passion was. But he didn't do anything. He put the letter back, in the same place, and began to live with that hidden truth as if there was still a chance that he was wrong. The next day, Jonathan offered to drive her to work, something he hadn't done in months. Emily hesitated for a second, but accepted with a smile that he almost believed was sincere. During the journey, he tried to start a conversation, asked about the projects, pretended to be extra interested. She responded with the naturalness of someone who has become accustomed to lying sweetly. Before getting out of the car, she left a quick kiss on his cheek and said, "Thank you, love." And that word, which had once been a promise, now sounded like a farewell. Days later, on a Saturday morning, Emily left early saying she would have a pedagogical meeting with a team of educators. Jonathan, without saying anything, decided to follow her. "I didn't know what I expected to find. A real meeting, a coffee with colleagues, or confirmation of what you feared." He parked the car at a safe distance and watched as she entered an elegant restaurant in the city center, clearly without any work supplies. She looked different. She wore a tight dress that didn't match her work speech, high heels, impeccable makeup. Minutes later, a man arrived. Tall, brown hair combed with precision, the appearance of someone who knew he was wanted. They greeted each other with a discreet kiss on the lips and sat down facing the restaurant's large window. Jonathan stood there, static, inside the car, watching the scene as if he were watching a movie he never wanted to see. Time passed slowly. He didn't cry. He didn't go out to confront them either. He just watched them. He saw the laughter, the intense looks, the touch of hands on the table. He saw Emily get up to go to the bathroom and the man take out his cell phone to check messages. He saw the waiter pour wine, and the two of them toast to something that, he knew, never involved his existence. And then, when he felt he couldn't take it anymore, Jonathan started the car and drove away. I didn't know exactly where. He drove to the field where he used to play football in his youth, sat down in the empty stands and stayed there for hours, without moving. The cold wind cut his face, but his chest burned with fire. And everything made sense now, the notes she didn't read, the nights on the couch, the strange perfumes, the empty smiles. When he returned home, Emily was already there. She was on the couch, watching a documentary, as if the day had gone exactly as she had said. Jonathan just watched her from the kitchen. She smiled when she saw him. He asked if he was okay. He replied yes. They had dinner together. They slept in the same room. She lay down first, he took longer. And as she slept, he sat on the side of the bed, staring at the ceiling, and he knew that something inside him had changed forever. In the following days, Jonathan was discreet. He began to act more attentively, more strategically. He copied the files from her old cell phone that were still in the backup, looked through diaries, saved evidence. Not to get revenge yet, but because he needed to be sure, he needed to understand the scale of what he was facing. And what she found was more than she expected: intimate messages, photos in places she said she was with friends, travel plans, phrases like, "I can't hide this for long." The truth was all there, out in the open, recorded by those who didn't even bother to erase the tracks. Jonathan spent sleepless nights, alternating between the computer and wine. He read the messages one by one, as if torturing himself was the only way to stay strong for what was to come. And then, at dinner with friends, he decided it was time to start his own act. He spoke enthusiastically about the wedding, made a toast to Emily, and thanked her for everything they had experienced together. She, surprised, was moved, thinking that he had finally returned to being the man he used to be. But Jonathan was no longer that man. And although his smile was real, what moved him now was something else. Something that grew within him with the same intensity with which he had loved, the desire to show her the price of it all. And for that, he needed the perfect occasion. And she arrived. The date was set. The guests would be the same as every year. The reason was noble, but the intention was different. Jonathan prepared every detail with surgical precision. It was time to reverse roles. It was time to give her back everything she had built, with her own lies. And at the exact moment he overheard, hidden, a new conversation between Emily and her best friend, describing in passionate detail how incredible her lover was. That was when he knew, it was time to act. But what Emily still didn't know was that, at that party, there would be something much bigger waiting for her than the simple revelation of her betrayal. Because there was a secret, and that secret would change everything. The salon was impeccable. The soft lights highlighted the golden tones of the decoration, the carefully chosen floral arrangements filled the room with a delicate and elegant aroma, and an instrumental track played softly, creating a serene, almost magical atmosphere. Emily arrived surrounded by praise and delighted looks. She looked stunning in a navy blue dress that highlighted the brightness of her eyes and the tone of her skin. He received hugs, gifts, compliments. Smile with the lightness of someone who believes they are in control of their own story. Jonathan followed her closely, attentive, calm, charismatic. The two seemed to radiate harmony, and no one there could have imagined that that night, marked as a celebration, was, in fact, the scene of a collapse. At one point, the music slowly stopped. The guests turned towards the small stage set up in the center of the room. Jonathan walked calmly up the steps, holding the microphone firmly. Emily smiled, delighted, unaware that, at that exact moment, her life was about to change forever. Jonathan thanked everyone for coming and spoke briefly about how significant that night was and about the wonderful woman who had been with him for so many years. And then, unexpectedly, he called Emily to his side. She walked towards him confidently, hugging him to the applause, with inflated vanity and the certainty that she would receive a passionate tribute. Jonathan looked at her for a few seconds in silence. The eyes were all on them. And when he spoke again, his voice sounded firm, slow, like someone choosing each word with the precision of a scalpel. He said that, throughout life, love goes through transformations. That there are phases, ups and downs, and that maturity consists of knowing how to deal with other people's imperfections. But he also said that love needs truth, respect and reciprocity. And then, calmly, he took a small remote control from his pocket and pointed it at the screen that opened behind them. Emily was still smiling, but her expression began to change when she heard her own voice echoing through the speakers, describing in intimate detail her passion for another man. The hall fell into silence. The guests looked at each other, perplexed. Some covered their mouths in shock, others looked away. Her voice, so confident and excited on the recording, now seemed like a scream of betrayal amid an audience of witnesses. Emily stood still. He tried to hold the microphone, but Jonathan gently stepped back and continued speaking, without raising his tone, without dramatizing. He said he had discovered everything weeks before, that he had time to feel every pain, every shame, every emptiness. That he loved that woman so much, that his first instinct was not anger, but denial. And even so, he decided not to confront her immediately. He decided, instead, to show her, and everyone, the weight of a hidden truth. Emily tried to interrupt him, whispering under her breath that it was inhumane, that he had no right, that they could talk later. But Jonathan looked her in the eyes and replied quietly, with a pained smile on his lips, that this was exactly what she had denied him, the right to know, the right to decide, the right to be respected. As the room murmured in tense whispers, he handed her a sealed envelope. Inside, divorce papers. Signed, filed, with all proof attached. Emily stumbled off the stage, holding the envelope in shaking hands. A group of friends followed her, trying to comfort her, but no one had words. Jonathan remained on stage for a few moments, thanked everyone for coming and apologized for the discomfort, before getting down and walking towards the exit. But what no one expected, what no one could predict, was yet to come. In the parking lot, as he exited through the back, Jonathan crossed paths with a man in a dark suit with a restrained expression. The two exchanged a brief look, without saying a word. Emily, seeing that man entering, froze. She tried to back away, tried to escape the eyes that turned to her again. But it was too late. The man approached the stage, asked to speak and was authorized by one of the event organizers. With a firm voice, he addressed the audience and said that he needed to clarify something important, something that had been hidden not only from Jonathan, but from everyone present there. He introduced himself as Thomas, a publishing businessman, and revealed that, in recent months, he had been having an affair with Emily. She said that the two met at a literature conference, and that she initially said she was separated. Just weeks later, she admitted to being married, but insisted that the marriage was dead, that Jonathan was just a fake partner, and that she didn't have the courage to end it for fear of backlash. Thomas believed it. He got deeply involved, made plans. But in recent days, he has begun to distrust Emily's honesty, especially after encountering her conversations with other people, flirting with the same enthusiasm. He realized he wasn't the only one. That there were others. And that, contrary to what she said, she never had any real intention of starting over with him. The hall was completely silent. Jonathan, who was already walking away, stopped when he heard Thomas's name and turned slowly. Emily, now pale, tried futilely to convince the man not to continue. But Thomas continued. He said that, beyond personal pain, there was something that needed to be said. Something that changed the course of everything. Emily, before meeting Thomas, had sent him, without knowing his true identity, a manuscript of a book she said she had written, asking for help in publishing it. A novel with autobiographical touches, full of memories, anguish and, above all, betrayal. The problem was that Thomas knew that text well. Not because he had read it before, but because it was a registered work written by another woman, who had died 3 years earlier, his wife. Emily had plagiarized entire passages from a dead woman's private diary, changing names and details, and sent it off as her own. The revelation fell like a bomb. Shock spread through the room like a wave of disbelief. Marital betrayal was not enough. Now, there was also emotional theft, the appropriation of pain that wasn't hers, the use of other people's words to conquer, seduce, manipulate. Thomas concluded by saying that he intended to file a lawsuit, both for plagiarism and defamation, as Emily had used his late wife's name in several intimate situations to victimize herself, saying that she was a close friend and that she suffered greatly after her death. Emily collapsed. He sat on the floor, with his face covered by his hands, unable to articulate any defense. People started to leave. What was supposed to be a celebration was now a spectacle of ruins. Jonathan, in silence, observed everything from afar. There was nothing more to say. There was nothing left to save. The woman he loved for more than a decade had become a stranger. And while she cried, surrounded by crumbs of an image that she herself created, he walked away with firm steps, feeling no longer the pain of betrayal, but the relief of no longer carrying the weight of a love that no longer existed. There was something liberating about watching the end. And even though his heart carried deep scars, at that moment, Jonathan knew that, sometimes, you have to see everything in ruins to finally rebuild yourself. The secret had been revealed. And with him, all that was left was the piercing silence that accompanies the truth when it finally prevails over the lies. The room gradually emptied, leaving behind a trail of forgotten glasses, judgmental looks and muffled murmurs that seemed to echo through the walls like ghosts of what had just happened. The sound of glasses being collected by the waiter's tense hands was the only thing that could be heard in that environment that, moments before, had been filled with laughter and music. Emily remained sitting on the floor for long minutes, her eyes fixed on any point, while her makeup ran without resistance down her haggard face. Around her, the decorations that had been carefully planned now seemed grotesque, as if silently mocking everything she tried to appear to be. Jonathan, already outside, walked alone on the wet sidewalk of the avenue, not knowing exactly where to go, but with the strange sensation that, for the first time in months, each step was being taken by his own choice. Hours later, Emily showed up at home. The same house where she so often pretended, hid and manipulated, now seemed cold, alien, a space where the walls seemed to know more than she did about the secrets she kept. He found Jonathan sitting at the kitchen table, with an unreadable expression. He didn't look sad, nor angry. Just exhausted. Among them, an open bottle of wine and 2 empty glasses. Emily hesitated before approaching. When he finally sat down, the silence was so thick it hurt. She tried to start something, anything, but her voice wouldn't come out. Jonathan then spoke first. He asked why. But it wasn't the common question. I didn't want details of meetings, of touching, of lies. I wanted to know what inside her had been lost to justify so many layers of destruction. Emily responded with the sincerity of someone who has already lost everything. She said that she never knew who she really was, that she spent her life trying to please, fulfill expectations, adapt to each relationship like an actress who changes her costume between scenes. He said that his love was the purest he had ever known, but that, precisely for that reason, he feared it. She felt like she didn't deserve it, that one day he would realize that she was smaller than she looked. And to protect herself from the rejection she believed was inevitable, she chose to betray before she was betrayed. Not for another man, but for herself. Jonathan listened to her without interrupting, his eyes fixed on hers. When he finally responded, his voice was low but firm. Said she could have said all this before. That he would have stayed. Who would have fought alongside her? But the lie is like rust, once present, the structure is never intact again. Emily cried in a restrained way, as if she knew that there was no more room for commotion, that the time for sensitivity had already passed and now what was left was to face the consequences. She apologized, not for the public exposure, not for the humiliation, but for not having been able to support him as he had supported her all those years. Jonathan, in turn, did not say he forgave. He also didn't say he hated it. He just got up and went to the bedroom, leaving her glass still empty on the table. In the following days, the house became a kind of emotional prison. Emily walked through the rooms as if looking for something that no longer existed, touching objects with the desperate nostalgia of someone trying to reconnect with memories that now hurt more than they comfort. Jonathan avoided staying in the same spaces as her for a long time. He spent hours in his makeshift basement office, pretending to work on unimportant projects. The divorce, although official, had not yet been consummated in practice. They lived like two strangers who shared the same roof only for lack of time, or courage, to leave. Until one afternoon, while organizing his documents into boxes, Jonathan found an old travel notebook. He leafed through it leisurely, stopping at pages full of notes made during the honeymoon. There, among handwritten words, there were drawings, promises, life plans that now seemed like pieces of a puzzle from an extinct world. When he closed the notebook, something changed in his face. He got up, put the box in the car and left without saying where he was going. Emily, watching him leave, felt a tightness in her chest that was no longer guilt, but something close to absolute emptiness. For the first time, I understood what it was like to truly be alone. Jonathan drove for hours. He stopped at a small seaside town where they had spent a weekend many years before. He stayed at a simple inn, walked along the deserted beach and allowed himself to breathe away the weight of disappointment. It was there, among the sound of the waves and the smell of sea air, that he met Sophia. She was the owner of the small cafe on the waterfront, a woman with a calm speech, attentive eyes and a calm that contrasted with the chaos that Jonathan carried within him. There were no games, no interests, just two souls meeting at the right time. The conversation started unpretentious, accompanied by hot coffee and cloudy afternoons. Sophia spoke truthfully, without fear of silence. Jonathan felt he could simply exist there, without needing to prove anything. He shared parts of his story, without going into details, and she listened to him with the patience of someone who understands that suffering does not need to be laid bare to be welcomed. It was little by little, without promises, that he found his lightness again. And it was when he realized that he was smiling effortlessly that he understood, he was free. Back at the old house, Emily tried to follow. The lawsuits with Thomas were progressing, and his reputation was in ruins. He tried to rebuild his career, but every place he reached had already heard fragments of the story. People talked, pointed, and even those who didn't know the details seemed to feel in the air that something in her had been broken. She thought about moving to another city, starting over. But deep down, she knew that the problem wasn't where she lived, but who she had become. Weeks later, Jonathan returned. He went to the house just to get the last of his belongings. He found Emily in the garden, trying to pull out weeds that had taken over the beds. She stood up when she saw him, hastily wiping her hands on her apron. The silence between them lasted long seconds until she said she didn't expect to see him so soon. Jonathan simply replied that he had come to get what was still his, and that after that there would be no reason to return. She watched him, as if she wanted to say something important, but found no words. When he was already leaving, with the boxes in the car, she approached. He said he had understood everything too late. Who spent his life seeking validation and forgot to see himself? Who didn't want pity, or a second chance? I just wanted to say thanks. Jonathan remained motionless for a moment, and then replied that no one deserves to live as a shadow of their own past. That she needed to make peace with the woman she chose to be. And that, despite everything, he wanted her to find herself again, away from other people's expectations. The car drove off, leaving behind the house, the history, the memories. On the road, Jonathan looked at the horizon and smiled discreetly. Because there, in the middle of the end, there was a beginning that did not depend on promises or justifications. And even though the traces of pain still echoed in some corner of the soul, they were no longer screams, they were just memories. Jonathan's car disappeared around the bend in the street, and Emily remained there in the garden, alone, with her hands still covered in dirt, as if that symbolic scene was the final materialization of what she had caused. The silence that hung over the house seemed even heavier than any other day, and she realized, for the first time with clarity, that it was no longer Jonathan's absence that hurt, but the suffocating presence of everything she had lost of herself. Every corner of the house carried an echo of what she once was at his side, but now everything sounded like a distorted memory, a life that no longer belonged to her. The television had been off for days, the books he loved lay dusty on the shelves, and the pictures hanging on the walls seemed to mock with their static images of happy times. It was as if time had frozen at the exact moment the truth became impossible to ignore. In the days that followed, Emily wandered around the house with her body present, but her mind disconnected from reality. She tried to get back to her routine, organize the paperwork for the case that was still going against her, rehearse a return to school, but nothing seemed to make sense. She felt empty, aimless, as if she had fallen into a well from which she no longer knew how to climb. And, paradoxically, the more he recognized his mistakes, the more difficult the path to reconstruction became. I received calls from old friends who, uncomfortable, wanted to know how I was doing, but none of them really wanted to listen. Even those who had promised unconditional support in the beginning now subtly withdrew, as if their presence was an uncomfortable reminder that the moral decline of someone so close could be a threat to their own illusions. Emily started to avoid markets, cafes, public spaces where she felt gazes weighing on her, even when they weren't directed. In contrast, Jonathan seemed to walk with a lightness that he himself did not immediately recognize. His life had settled into a quieter, more sincere rhythm. The relationship with Sophia evolved without haste, without rash promises or far-fetched plans, just an honest exchange between two people willing to listen, respect and live one day at a time. Sophia taught him to breathe outside of obligation, to listen to silence without fear, to sleep without weight on his chest. And although the past was still present, not as a ghost, but as a scar, he was beginning to see the possibility of a future that was not shaped by trauma. Still, inside him, there was a part that refused to become indifferent to Emily's pain. It wasn't love, nor longing, but a deep awareness that, despite everything, she was an essential piece of the story that transformed him. That's why, one afternoon, when he received an unexpected call from a familiar number, Jonathan answered. On the other end of the line, Emily's voice came haltingly, brokenly. He did not ask for forgiveness, nor did he explicitly mention regret. He just asked if they could meet, somewhere neutral, for a definitive conversation. He accepted, not out of curiosity or nostalgia, but because he knew that closing chapters requires courage, and that perhaps this was the last bridge to be crossed before moving on completely in peace. They met in a discreet park, away from known eyes. The place had aged wooden benches, trees that swayed in the late afternoon wind and a pond where ducks swam in lazy circles. Emily arrived first, sitting with her head down, wrapping her fingers around the cuffs of her coat as if trying to hold her own body with her hands. When Jonathan approached, she looked up with a mixture of shame and relief. They said few greetings, and then silence settled between them again, no longer hostile, but filled with everything that no longer needed to be said. Emily spoke first, not to justify herself, but to admit it. He said he understood that what destroyed his marriage was not just the betrayal itself, but the continued cowardice of not choosing to face his own shadows. That the fear of failing in his eyes made her lie so much that she no longer knew what was true. She confessed that she not only cheated, but betrayed herself, and that she has never felt whole since. Jonathan listened to her without interrupting, and when he responded, it wasn't to comfort. He said she needed to rebuild herself, not for him, not for others, but for herself. That her worst punishment would not come from justice, nor from comments on social media, but from living with a version of herself that she now knew how to recognize as harmful. Emily nodded, and then, with teary eyes, asked if he had managed to be happy again. Jonathan was silent for a few seconds, looking at the lake. He said he was learning. That he had met someone who made him smile naturally. Who didn't know what lay ahead, but who no longer carried the guilt of having failed as a man, husband or partner. Emily smiled, a sad but sincere smile. She said she felt relieved knowing that at least he had made it out in one piece. And then, without warning, he got up, thanked him for the conversation and walked away. There were no hugs, no formal goodbyes. Just two finally distinct paths, traced with the maturity of someone who understood that certain encounters only serve to teach how to move on. Jonathan remained there for a few more minutes, looking in the direction she had gone. She felt a cold breeze touch her face and closed her eyes for a moment. He thought about everything they had experienced, the versions of themselves that had died and those that were now being reborn. There was something deeply human about that moment. Something that couldn't be said in words, only felt. A rare type of closure that doesn't scream, but says goodbye in silence. Later that same night, when he returned home, he found Sophia on the porch, reading under the yellow light of the lamp. When she saw him, she didn't ask anything. He just smiled with the softness of someone who understands what doesn't need to be explained. Jonathan sat next to her, and for a few moments they said nothing. The outside world could wait. There was, there in that small shared gesture, a kind of peace that he found impossible to find again. It wasn't the same love as the past, and that was what comforted him the most. He was another, born of grief and hope, mature and serene, made of conscious choices. Meanwhile, Emily, lying on the bed in a small rented room downtown, stared sleeplessly at the ceiling. The bare walls seemed to constrict the space, but there was an absence of masks that she was beginning to appreciate. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was living with the truth, raw, painful, but necessary. And it was in this state of vulnerability that she began to write. Not to post, not to impress, but to understand. He wrote to find himself again. And, between one sentence and another, I felt again that there were still parts of it that could be saved. He was no longer trying to justify what he did, nor was he seeking immediate redemption. I just accepted it. And upon acceptance, the reconstruction began. The pain, now, was no longer punishment, but transformation. Each tear that flowed was a layer of defense that fell. And by allowing herself to cry, Emily also allowed herself to heal. The world around her was still the same, but inside her, something new was beginning to germinate. Something that, perhaps, one day, would make her look back with compassion, not for herself, but for the lost versions that had to collapse so that a new one could finally be born. In the week following the reunion in the park, life took on a new rhythm. Jonathan, for the first time in a long time, started waking up without that weight on his chest, as if the silent goodbye with Emily had definitively ended a cycle that seemed to drag on in suspense for months. There were no longer any doubts, there were no ghosts haunting the memories, just the clear awareness that he had done everything he could, and perhaps even more than he should have. With Sophia, the days continued to be light, but increasingly deeper. The relationship between them gained consistency, not out of necessity, but due to the affinity of souls who found each other when they had already lost faith in new beginnings. He told her not just about the past, but about the silences he had experienced, the nights he had spent awake next to someone who slept as if he were the only person in the world. Sophia didn't judge, nor did she try to fix him. She just listened, with such honest empathy that sometimes all it took was a look from her for Jonathan to feel understood. One day, during a lazy breakfast on the balcony, Sophia talked about an invitation to spend a season abroad, in a seaside villa where she had friends working on a cultural project. She didn't pressure him, she didn't make plans for him, she just shared the invitation with the naturalness of someone who respects other people's time. Jonathan was silent for a few minutes, and then said he needed time to think. Not because he didn't want to go, but because, deep down, he felt that there was still something to be resolved, a last link that, although it no longer held him back, still needed to be released with his own hands. Meanwhile, Emily decided to move. The place where she lived with Jonathan had been officially sold, and with the symbolic value that accrued to her after the divorce, she rented a small apartment at the top of an old building, where the morning sun hit strongly and where she felt that she could, finally, start over without the shadow of the past on every wall. The boxes were stacked, the furniture was yet to be organized, but there was new relief in the clutter. It was a deconstructed life that she finally took on. Among the papers from the still pending case with Thomas, unanswered letters from former colleagues and unpaid bills, Emily chose to write. Not as an escape, but as a confrontation. And on each page he filled, he rewrote not the past, but the way he decided to carry his story from now on. One day, he received an unexpected visit from Beatrice, his former best friend, who had cut off contact for months after the public revelation at the party. Emily didn't know how to react when she saw her at the door, her eyes wet and her hands restless holding a bag of bread and simple flowers. Beatrice did not apologize, nor did she wait for them. He just said he couldn't sleep well since that night. That, even though he had walked away so as not to get involved, he felt he needed to see her, hear her voice, know if there was still something true in the friendship they had. Emily let her in, offered her coffee, and the two spent the afternoon remembering not the mistakes, but the good times, the advice exchanged, the fears shared in confidences that had not been feigned. For the first time in a long time, Emily cried differently, not with guilt, but with gratitude that someone had returned without demanding explanations, just with the desire to welcome what was left. And in that reunion, he realized that starting over did not mean erasing the past, but learning to live with it as part of the landscape of the soul. Jonathan, in turn, returned to the city to resolve issues related to the sale of the old property. He took the opportunity to visit his sister, who had been one of the few silent pillars during the turmoil of the previous months. Sitting in his childhood kitchen, where so many important conversations and decisions had been made, he shared Sophia's invitation with her. The sister listened attentively and, in the end, held her hands firmly and said that sometimes you have to leave everything behind, not out of weakness, but out of wisdom. That there was something profoundly courageous about abandoning a scorched earth and accepting to flourish on another soil. Jonathan smiled and, that night, he made the decision that would change his life once again. Days later, on a clear morning, he met Emily for the last time. There was no resentment, no irony, just a mutual desire to end everything with dignity. They sat on a bench in the square, the same one where he had asked for her hand in marriage so many years ago. Emily, upon seeing him approach, couldn't contain her emotion, but she also didn't allow herself to fall into sentimentality. He said that he was truly starting over, that he had signed up for a writing course and that perhaps one day he would be able to tell his own story without shame. Jonathan just looked at her and said he was rooting for it. Not because I wanted to see a heroic version of her, but because I knew that no one deserves to spend the rest of their life in ruins. Before they said goodbye, she took an envelope out of her bag. She said she didn't expect him to read it, but that she had written there everything she never had the courage to say, not about the betrayal, but about the years they lived, about what they learned together, about what she still carried from him. Jonathan accepted the envelope but did not open it. He said he would do it when he felt the time was right. And then they stood up, exchanged one last look, and walked away, each in a different direction, with the certainty that, sometimes, the hardest thing is not to let someone go, but to let yourself go. Once home, Jonathan calmly prepared his bags. Sophia was waiting for him at the airport with a discreet smile and the attentive eyes of someone who knew the value of time. Before leaving, he walked through his old room, now empty, and left Emily's envelope on the desk. Not because I despised what she had written, but because I understood that certain answers lose their meaning when the heart has already chosen to follow. He went down the stairs with firm steps, went through the door and closed it for the last time, without rushing, but without looking back. On the plane, with Sophia by his side, Jonathan looked out the window and saw the city disappear under the clouds. I didn't feel relief, nor euphoria, but something deeper, a kind of serenity built not on victory, but on understanding. He knew he had loved, suffered, and finally freed himself. And when he took Sophia's hand, he realized that loving again wasn't about forgetting what happened, but choosing to continue, even with the scars. Emily, in turn, wrote. In the small apartment, with the window open and the distant sound of traffic, she finally put into words what she pretended not to feel for years. I wrote about the fear of not being enough, about the loneliness that exists even when you are with someone, about the mistakes that are repeated because you don't know any other way of being. And when she finished the last page, she cried, not out of regret, but because she knew that there, in that painful and honest writing, there was a woman who, although lost, was beginning to find herself again. Not to get someone back, but to finally become someone who one day deserves to be loved again. The village where Jonathan decided to start over was small, surrounded by gentle mountains and the constant sound of the sea crashing against the rocks. Cobblestone streets led to hidden cafes and quiet bookstores, where time seemed to flow more gently. He and Sophia found a simple house with large windows and a balcony that faced the sea. Nothing exaggerated, nothing luxurious, just the tranquility that comes from truth. There, mornings began with shared silence and days were filled with walks, conversations and the slow construction of a life that didn't need to hide behind forced smiles. Jonathan became involved with a local project to restore historic buildings, something that combined his profession with his new desire to restore beauty to things that time had almost erased. And it was in this work, far from everything that once hurt him, that he understood that true victory is not in proving anything to anyone, but in living at peace with oneself. Sophia, by his side, continued to be a presence, not a filler. It didn't require him to forget what he'd been through, just that he didn't let it decide what came next. His way of loving was silent, mature, built on small gestures, a cup of coffee left next to the bed, a note stuck to the door, and attentive listening during the nights when the past still tried to infiltrate through the cracks of memory. Jonathan no longer needed to be strong all the time. With her, he could be whole. And that, after all, was a rare gift. Emily, in turn, had to deal with a less poetic beginning. The rented apartment was modest, the neighborhood was busy, and the judging eyes still followed her like shadows in some places. But she learned to live with it. He began giving small writing workshops at a community cultural center, using his experiences as a starting point for reflections on choices, regrets and reconstruction. It was hard, often lonely, but there was an honesty to the process that made her feel alive in a new way. There was no more makeup to cover up failures, nor stories invented to mask shortcomings. There was just her, with all her mistakes, writing to try to understand the woman she was and the woman she wanted to be. One day, during one of the workshops, a young woman asked her if she believed in redemption. Emily responded that she believed in responsibility. That redemption is something that can come, yes, but the important thing was to be willing to face what was caused to others. And that sometimes, the hardest forgiveness is the one we need to give ourselves. News about Thomas also circulated. The case against Emily was settled with a confidential settlement. He, who previously seemed like a symbol of her destruction, followed his path silently, moving away from everything that linked him to that story. He got back together with family members, dedicated himself to personal projects, and although he never looked for Emily again, in interviews he gave some time later about ethics in literature and the appropriation of other people's stories, he mentioned that he had learned the hard way about the price of trusting too much in charming faces. His tone was not vengeful, but marked by the bitterness of someone who knows that there are wounds that do not heal with time, but only settle in some corner of the soul. Years passed. Jonathan, now with grayer hair, walked through a crafts fair hand in hand with Sophia. When he saw a small used book stand, he stopped to leaf through the copies, until his eyes fell on a familiar title. It was a small book with a simple cover, with the dedication signed by Emily. It wasn't a bestseller, nor a critically celebrated work, but there was something honest there. He quickly leafed through and recognized some excerpts, not from the letters she had written to him, but from the life they lived. There was naked pain, but also a rare lucidity. He bought the book without discussing it with Sophia, and that night, by the fireplace, he read each page in silence. When he finished, he didn't cry, nor did he smile. He just closed the book and placed it on the shelf, like someone keeping a part of their life that, although painful, deserves a place of respect. Emily, in turn, had accepted an invitation to give a talk on personal reconstruction at a modest event. She was nervous, her hands were shaking and her voice wavered at first, but when she looked at the audience, she saw attentive faces, young and old, who were also carrying their own pieces. He spoke truthfully, without hiding. He talked about his failures, about how he tried to pretend to be strong until the world collapsed, about the pain of destroying something you love. But he also talked about courage. About the moment he realized he no longer needed to apologize for each step, but rather walk differently. She was applauded, not with empty enthusiasm, but with a silent admiration that ultimately made her feel that maybe, just maybe, her pain had served some greater purpose. On a cloudy morning, Jonathan was walking along the beach. Sophia was still sleeping, and he enjoyed that time alone as a silent ritual. In the distance he saw a woman sitting on the sand, writing in a notebook. For a moment, he thought it was Emily. He got just close enough to see that it wasn't. He smiled to himself, sat down on a rock and let the wind carry the thought away. He thought that if he ever crossed paths with her again, he would have no more questions. And that was what surprised him most, not wanting to understand anymore, not wanting anything anymore. Just genuinely wishing she was at peace. Jonathan and Emily's story did not have a traditional happy ending, but it did have something rarer, a true ending. They were accomplices, then strangers, then memory. And each phase carried its importance. Betrayal destroyed a marriage, but it revealed much more than lies. It revealed old absences, deep insecurities, and the cruel weight of the masks we wear to survive. In the end, what remained was each person's decision. Jonathan chose to live fully and serenely alongside those who saw him truthfully. Emily chose to face herself and rise again, not to please, but to exist fully. Sophia continued to be the firm support point, who did not need to compete with any past to be present. And they all, in their own way, found what they had lost, the freedom to be exactly who they decided to be after everything. And now that you've come this far, comment what you thought of this story. Would you have reacted like Jonathan? Would he have given Emily a chance? Your opinion is very important. And of course, if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, take the opportunity to subscribe right now and activate the bell so you don't miss any of the next stories. Here, our narratives are intense, true, and with a single mission, to make you feel, reflect, and get emotional. And once again we make it clear, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. The stories are fictional, created to show the devastating impact that a lack of truth can cause. Until the next story.